The goat had just knocked over my produce display when I heard her screech from across the property line. Her voice so sharp it could have shattered glass, and I swear even the crows went silent for a second. This is a violation of HOA Regulation 7.3.5. She bellowed, and before I could respond, my prize-winning rooster, Chester, puffed out his chest and crowed right in her face like he'd been waiting for that moment his whole life, and I swear I saw steam shoot out of her ears. 3 neighbors immediately pulled out their phones to record the spectacle, while the mailman just shook his head. Sighed like this was all too familiar, and kept on walking. By the time she finished her tirade about unauthorized agricultural activities, my llama Ferdinand had casually strolled over and started eating half the violation notice she was waving around, chewing with the kind of slow, deliberate disrespect only a llama could pull off. That's when she screamed the words that would seal her fate forever. Words so ridiculous, they silenced even the goats. I demand 50% of everything you make on this farm, or I'll shut you down by Monday. My name is Daniel Morrison, and 6 months earlier, I inherited this 3-acre farm from my grandfather. It sits on the very edge of Cypress Ridge Estates, technically within the subdivision boundaries, but grandfathered in with agricultural zoning that dated back to 1947. Long before the Homeowners Association had ever existed. I kept to myself, worked the soil, grew organic vegetables, raised a handful of animals, and sold eggs, honey, and produce at the local farmers market on weekends. My land had been there before the HOA was even a thought. But none of that ever seemed to matter to Margaret Whitmore, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood. Margaret was the type of woman who measured grass height with a ruler and fined families for leaving their garbage bins out 5 minutes too long. Once, she actually fined a couple $300 because their garden gnome was facing the wrong direction. She had memorized every line of the HOA handbook, real or imagined, and wielded those rules like weapons. Her husband trailing behind her in silence, nodding at every rant like a man who had long since given up hope. She drove around the neighborhood in a white SUV with HOA president, magnets slapped on both sides, a title she held only because no one else wanted to deal with her power trips. My trouble with her began the day I set up a small honor system stand at the community entrance, selling my grandfather's famous honey. Within an hour, Margaret marched up with her clipboard and sour expression, declaring it an unauthorized commercial enterprise and insisting that any business inside HOA boundaries required board approval and, more outrageously, a share of the profits. When I laughed at her and told her she was out of her mind, she leaned in, narrowed her eyes, and said with a venomous tone, "We'll see about that, Mr. Morrison." The next morning, I woke up to my first violation notice. According to her, my chicken coop was 3 inches too close to the property line. Never mind that it had stood in the same place since 1962. The second violation came days later, claiming excessive animal noise, though the only complaint came from Margaret herself. The third was even more absurd. My vegetable garden exceeded the maximum allowable square footage for agricultural use, never mind that my land was officially zoned agricultural long before her HOA existed. At first, I tried to be reasonable. I attended the next HOA meeting and calmly explained that my property carried exemptions that predated the subdivision. Margaret's face turned purple as she slammed her fist on the table and declared with absolute certainty, "Those old zoning laws don't apply anymore. The HOA supersedes all previous arrangements." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody dared contradict her. Then she produced a document she called a new profit-sharing agreement, claiming it required all home-based businesses to surrender 50% of their revenue to the HOA General Fund. When I asked to see the charter that authorized such nonsense, she smirked and said it was being updated and would be available soon. She actually tried to make me sign her homemade contract right there, in front of everyone. The paper looked like it had been typed up that very morning in Comic Sans font. One brave neighbor dared to ask if this had been voted on, and Margaret snapped back that the board has emergency powers to implement financial measures. There was no such clause in our HOA agreement, but again, nobody challenged her. From that point on, the harassment escalated. She began showing up during my farmer's market prep, snapping photos, muttering about health code violations, and even calling the county inspector 4 times in 1 week, accusing me of running an illegal slaughterhouse. By the 4th visit, the inspector told me he was considering filing harassment charges against her. She went so far as to organize a boycott of my stand, handing out flyers at the market that read, "Support your HOA, not rogue farmers." Things got even crazier when she installed a security camera pointed directly at my property, claiming she needed evidence of my violations. Every day she sent me emails with timestamps of when Chester crowed, when my wheelbarrow moved, when customers bought eggs. At the end of each email, she attached an invoice, charging me $50 an hour for her monitoring services. The insanity peaked on a Thursday, when she showed up with 2 people she introduced as her legal team. Her nephew, who had dropped out of law school, and his girlfriend, who sold essential oils. They handed me a cease and desist letter so poorly written, it cited laws from 3 different states, none of which were ours, and was topped with a Microsoft Paint letterhead featuring clip art scales of justice. Margaret crossed her arms and declared, "You have 72 hours to comply with HOA revenue sharing requirements, or we will begin foreclosure proceedings on your property." Her nephew nodded seriously while his girlfriend scribbled notes on a napkin. Then Margaret demanded I also pay all past revenues, which she claimed amounted to $37,482. When I asked how she came up with that number, she proudly presented a spiral notebook full of bizarre math equations that included things like chicken, noise tax, and vegetable viewing fees. She was literally trying to charge me for people looking at my garden. That's when I called my cousin Bradley, a real lawyer who specialized in property law. Bradley took one look at her so-called documents and burst out laughing. Within 24 hours, he had drafted a formal response listing the numerous crimes Margaret had committed: extortion, harassment, fraud, and impersonating legal authority. But Bradley didn't stop there. In his research, he uncovered something far juicy. Margaret had been skimming money from the HOA for years, funneling funds into personal purchases she labeled as neighborhood improvements. The investigation that followed was brutal. It turned out she had been running similar scams with other homeowners. She forced a bakery owner to supply free cakes for HOA meetings that never happened, demanded discounts from a freelance accountant in exchange for ignoring supposed violations, and even tried to claim ownership of a neighbor's Etsy jewelry business because they stored inventory in their garage. The state attorney's office got involved when they discovered she had forged official HOA documents, faked meeting minutes granting herself powers that didn't exist, and created bogus vendor invoices to withdraw cash. Even the cameras she had pointed at my property were being paid for with HOA funds, but registered to her personal account. The emergency meeting called to address all this became the most attended in neighborhood history. Margaret strutted in wearing a power suit purchased with HOA money. Corsigned tried to call the meeting to order, but the vice president immediately suspended her pending investigation. The look on her face when she realized her authority was gone was priceless. She shouted that everything she'd done was for the good of the community, accused me of corrupting the neighborhood with agricultural propaganda, and even claimed my chickens were driving down property values. When the vote came to remove her from the board, it was unanimous except for her own vote. Margaret's voice shook as she declared, "You're all making a huge mistake. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." 2 weeks later, criminal charges were filed: extortion, embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and tax evasion. The IRS piled on after discovering she hadn't reported a dime of the money she skimmed. The State Real Estate Commission revoked her license. By the end, she was facing 17 separate charges. At her trial, she made the mistake of representing herself. She claimed HOA presidents had sovereign immunity, argued my farm posed a national security threat, and tried to submit her spiral notebook as evidence of damages. She even accused me of training Chester to crow on command just to torment her. The judge's patience ran thin quickly. When the verdict came, Margaret was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for tax evasion, 2 more for embezzlement to run concurrently, ordered to pay $187,000 in restitution, and slapped with 500 hours of community service at local farms. The judge announced that last part with a barely concealed smirk. Margaret's jaw dropped as the sentence was read. And when the final tally hit, she fainted dramatically right into her nephew's arms. He didn't catch her in time, and she crumpled to the courtroom floor. The once untouchable queen of Cypress Ridge Estates, brought down by a rooster, a llama, and the very farm she tried to destroy.